We ask for all guidance and blessing on this council. May the true needs and well-being of our communities be our concern. Help us who serve as leaders to remember that all our decisions are made in the best interests of the people, culture and environment of the Corangamite Shire. Amen. We'll acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present. I'd just like to welcome all councillors. This will be our second last meeting, and welcome anyone who's joined us online. We hope that we don't have any technical difficulties, so I'll introduce our councillors. From the Central Ward, we have Councillor Ruth Castrain, Councillor Helen Durant, Councillor Geraldine Canady. From the South Central Ward, we have Councillor Joe Beard. From the South Ward, we have Councillor Simon Illingworth. From the Southwest, we have myself, Mayor Neil Trotter. And from the North, we have Councillor Leslie Brown. Do we have any apologies, Mr. Mason? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, there's no apologies or declarations of conflict of interest for today's meeting.
Thank you. Councillors, can I have someone confirm the minutes of the previous meeting? Thank you. Councillor Castrain and Councillor Brown. Councillor Castrain, any comment?
No comment, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Councillor Brown. Councillors, any further comment? All those in favour? Thank you. Carried. We have no deputations or presentations? We'll move on to item number 7, Officers' Report. This is 7.1. 2019-2020 financial statements and performance report. Mr. Ray, thank you.
Mayor, thank you, and through you. Councillors, good afternoon. There are a single agenda item this afternoon is for you to consider the financial statements and performance statement for the 1920 financial year and to give in principle approval to those statements and authorise 2 councillors to sign them in their final form. These are requirements under the Local Government Act. Councillors, if I may indulge you for a moment and step through some of the key highlights of the statements and performance statement. The financial statements comprise 5 principal statements and their note disclosures. The statements comply with the Australian accounting standards and the Local Government Planning and Reporting Regulation. The income statement is a record of income and expenditure recognised during the course of the year. Almost $48 million of income has been recognised and around $47.4 million in expenses recognised. The result for the year is a small surplus of $378,000, effectively a break-even result. It's important to note that this is an accounting result. It includes a number of non-cash transactions, and I wish to highlight the just over $3 million on the disposal of infrastructure assets. The variations to the budget are detailed in the officer's report and the financial statements. Councillors, the impacts of COVID-19 on the result are largely negligible. We'll see if at all greater results in the current financial year. The balance sheet, councillors, is a statement of council's financial position as at the 30th of June. The net working capital position is relatively healthy at $30.3 million net. The balance sheet reflects council's nil borrowing status. It's important to note there are short and long-term liabilities of around $24 million. This includes trade payables, employee entitlements, a range of provisions, unearned revenue and lease liabilities. I think what's also pleasing, councils, is that the balance sheet does indicate that as a council you are custodian of almost $500 million of community assets. So that's a figure that should be of interest to our community. and the balance sheet reflects a net asset position of $507 million. The statement of changes in equity reflects the impact of the financial result and movements in equity, including the impact of asset revaluations that occurred during the course of the year. That statement of changes in equity also discloses Council's cash reserves of around about $13 million. The statement of cash flows is a record of inflows and outflows to and from the organisation over the course of the year across operating, investing and financing activities. The net change in cash equivalents for the year was an increase of $3 million. The statement of capital works indicates that $14.3 million in assets was constructed or invested in during the course of the year. Importantly, the majority of those, 85%, was spent on renewing or upgrading existing assets. It's around $12.2 million. And 3/4 of Council's capital works program, almost $9 million, was spent on roads and bridges. There's been some changes in accounting standards that have impacted the result, and that's documented in the report and also the statements themselves. They've also slightly impacted the liquidity ratio and indebtedness ratio as well. Nevertheless, the financial indicators, relatively speaking, are in a low to medium risk range. The performance statement, as required under legislation and regulation, detail the service indicators and the financial performance indicators for the year. In reading this report, councillors, the trend is your friend. And so the results generally are within trend. There are some positive or negative movements. Where there are major movements, their comments have been provided appropriately. There are some underwhelming results, and as has been reflected through our community satisfaction survey results. That's in relation to roads. The statements are subject to audit by the Victorian Auditor General's Office, and these statements have also been considered by Council's Audit and Risk Committee. The committee was briefed by the auditor on the 17th of September, and no matters were raised that would preclude Council for approving these statements in principle or authorising to councillors to sign them in their final form. And so the committee has recommended to Council that you should give in principle approval and authorise councillors to sign them. The next steps, councillors, subject to your decision this afternoon, is to finalise the statements and submit them to the Victorian Auditor General's Office, who will then issue the audit opinion. These statements, along with the audit opinion and the governance and management checklist, will then be included in the annual report, and that annual report will then be submitted to the Minister for Local Government. Council then will be asked to consider the annual report at the last meeting of this term on the 20th of October. Mayor, the recommendation is before you. It's largely somewhat administrative in its nature, but it's an important recommendation because the statements themselves reflect Council's financial position. They've gone through an audit process and been independently verified. Mayor Adam Taylor, Manager of Finance, is also with us this afternoon to avail any specific questions associated with the statements. Thank you, Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Ray. Thanks for your report. Councillors, we have the recommendation before you. Can I have someone move the recommendation? Councillor Durant, do we have a seconder? Councillor Gistrain. Councillor Durant? You're on mute, Councillor.
I didn't move it, Mayor. That wasn't me.
Oh, I saw a hand wave. I thought it was yours.
I'm happy to move, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Gistrain, do we have a seconder? Councillor Baird. Councillor Gistrain.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm happy to move this report in principle, and also for Councillor Durant and Councillor Brown to sign on behalf of councillors of the council as members of our audit committee who have previously reviewed this report, As Mr. Ray has mentioned, this council is in a good financial position. Generally, indicators are strong, which is excellent news. We have good reserves, as outlined, about $13 million in reserves, which obviously are earmarked for things in like a superannuation call, which we've seen in the past, rehabilitation of the landfill, and importantly, major projects and infrastructure, sort of projects that are big ticket items like the Port Campbell streetscape. So it's important that we put some funds aside for that. And again, the council continues to be debt-free with no borrowings this year, which is good news. I think that perhaps our ability to react very quickly after the announcement of the COVID-19 pandemic. So back in March was when we first highlighted that a stimulus package was to be introduced, and the council were able to offer rent relief. We've reviewed our hardship policy. There's been a number of initiatives that have been put up as part of the stimulus package of $2.5 million, including fee waivers, employment. We've got a number of staff who are working with us through the Working for Victoria. I think there's 43. Small business funds, the economic development impetus has certainly been well received, as has been the community capacity building. So I think overall, even reading the performance reports, there are some good indicators, and we do talk about roads which do bring us down, but it's our biggest expense item in our budget. So I congratulate Mr. Ray, Mr. Taylor and their staff on preparing the financial reports, and we'll look forward to finalising them at the end of October. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Castrain. Councillor Baird.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Look, as Director Ray had alluded to before, it is certainly administrative, but it's one of the important roles that we as the elected officials have on behalf of our communities. And I think it's really important that as ratepayers ourselves, that we actually be really pretty satisfied, I would think, looking over these financial statements in which the organisation has brought all that together. Yes, the surplus may not be as big as what it was first anticipated to be, but gee, even having a surplus is far better than what it could have been in considering the circumstances that we're finding not only our communities in, but the entire world. So I still think the results that are there is still incredibly rewarding, and we should all be proud of it, not only council, the entire organisation as a whole. I really value the expertise that we have on our audit and risk committee, along with our council staff, our independent members and our councillors that represent us on that committee, including Mayor as the ex officio on there too. But I think the fact that this has already gone through them, there was no questions that were raised through that committee in that process, I think is something that we need to take on board as well. So for me, and following on what Councillor Castrain has said, I really don't have anything further to add, but just congratulations to the organisation. And in principle, I'm more than happy to support the recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Baird. Councillors, any further comment? Councillor Durant.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. New accounting standards and additional depreciation and amortisation of our assets have affected council's bottom line and see us with a reduced surplus. Despite these impacts, this is a very solid result for council and puts us in a good financial position. We have significantly low levels of indebtedness, and our average asset renewal ratio will be over 100% in future forecast budgets, which is really important that we can continue to look after the assets that we have. And these are all positive indicators of sound financial management. I note Mr. Ray's comments that our auditors have made their observations on these statements and that they consider they are presented fairly, and that Council's Audit and Risk Committee has also recommended that in principle approval be given to these statements. Thank you.
Councillor Durant. Councillors, any further comment? Yeah, I'd just like to add special thanks to the officers for this report. It's been a year like no other, with the COVID pandemic has resulted in a large workload for our financial team. We have, despite the huge workload, been able to bring down a budget and meet our reporting obligations to the state government. And despite the changed circumstances brought about by the pandemic, council remains in a sound financial position and is well placed to meet some of the formidable challenges that we're going to face going forward. Probably a note of caution that the incoming council will probably need to keep a close eye on maintaining the fundamentals over the next few years. We've already seen a reduction in financial assistance grants, and I believe incoming councils will have some formidable financial challenges, and that perhaps funding is not going to be as readily available as it has been in the past. So keeping an eye on those fundamentals is going to be pretty important. So without any further ado, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Well, it's a very short meeting. Thank you all for your attendance, and I'll close the meeting. Thank you.